It's my pleasure to introduce Gerry Berenholz, who really doesn't need any introduction because many of you know her. But let me just give you a little background. First of all, would everybody please mute their phones? Yeah, okay, thank you. She grew up in the Bronx and went to two public schools, 26 and 82. Oh, sorry. Went to two public schools, 26 and 82 in the Bronx, and then Bronx High School of Science, and then City College of New York. After graduation, she worked briefly in the laboratory of Dr. Robert Austrian at Kings County Hospital, working on pneumococcal pneumonia. But she didn't stay long there because she and her husband met and got married and moved to West Hartford. With the arrival of their first child, she became a stay-at-home mother, and then she, several years later, studied and got a certificate in health information management from Northeastern. Before she took her national exam, she was hired to set up a program for health record technicians at Mass Bay Community College. She quickly advanced to chairperson of the nursing and allied health professions, and then to assistant dean. After 8 years at Mass Bay, she was accepted in the first class in the evening program of Boston University and received a master's in public health. She then went on with her new degree, resigned from Mass Bay, and started consulting. Many of her graduates were working in hospitals and other health facilities all around the Commonwealth. And when they heard that she was unattached, they hired her or recommended her to be hired in their hospitals. She became very knowledgeable in coding systems of diseases and operations, with special emphasis on intentional and unintentional injuries and poisoning. She was in demand to offer workshops for health departments throughout the US and began getting offers from many government agencies. So she has a very full resume with many different degrees, and but she worked for the CDC and the WHO. And but you'll be interested that one of the things that she worked under the Undersecretary of Defense for Health Affairs to help them gather data on noise-induced hearing loss and musculoskeletal injuries during basic training. And these accounted for more injuries than those from military engagements. So our deafness isn't that new either. Anyway, she then went on and did a lot of teaching. And when she came to Newbridge, she didn't give up teaching. She did a course on Serbia, on the history of Serbia.
Siberia,
sorry. Right. Anyway, and then she also taught a course on American Indian in US history and the history of the Gypsies. But now she's going to talk to us about something totally different, and I'll let her introduce that.
thank you. Good afternoon. I have a lot of information about Azerbaijan to share with you. I just want to say that my information stopped around 2022 when Putin really shut down Russia, so that information was not getting out. I think you've read this slide. If you've been here, you've probably read it 42 times. I don't have to read it to you. But it is of interest to know that it is a town and a center of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Russia. And it has two official languages, Russian and Yiddish. And the question is, where is it? This is a map of the route from Moscow, which is somewhere up here. I don't think I can show it to you. Okay. You can see Moscow in the upper left, and all the way across Russia, which is quite large. The blue arrow is pointing to where Birobidzhan is, and the last of the red line is going down to Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean. The Trans-Siberian Railway goes all the way from European Russia, where Moscow is, across the Ural Mountains, into Asia, and it goes all the way to the Far East. So one of the first questions that people would ask is, what is an oblast? An oblast is an administrative division. It's often translated into English as a region or province. Every oblast has a government with authority over a defined geographical area, and each has representation in the Russian Federal Union. The government of the oblast consists of a state legislature, which is called the Oblast Duma, a governor who has the highest executive position, and both are democratically elected. At least that's what they said on their website. In 2015, the governors were restricted to a term of 5 years with no more than 2 consecutive terms. That was the result of having earlier oblast governors who served very long terms, and they ended up getting very rich on the system. By shortening the terms, it was felt it would take them time to figure out what their jobs were and then figure out how to start siphoning off some of the assets before they were being replaced. There are currently 46 oblasts in Russia, and as I said, most of them are named after their administrative center, which is the official term for a capital city, and it's generally the largest city in the oblast. So the town of Birobidzhan is the capital city of the autonomous oblast of Birobidzhan. Jewish people have been living in Siberia for many centuries. Under the Tsars, the Jews, who numbered approximately 5 million in the Russian Empire in the 1880s, had been confined to a pale of settlement where they experienced prejudice and persecution, often in the form of discriminatory laws. And those laws were either organized by or tacitly approved by the Tsarist authorities. Just a short digression here. What is a pale? The Pale of Settlement was a western region of the Russian Empire, and it was created by Catherine the Great and existed from 1791 to 1917. And within the Pale, permanent residency by Jews was allowed. Beyond that region, Jewish residency, permanent or temporary, was mostly forbidden. They also were not permitted to live within 50 kilometers, which is about 30 miles, of the western border of the Pale. The motivation behind that was to restrict trade between Jews and native Russians. The influx of skilled Jewish merchants and artisans into the empire really intimidated those same classes of Moscow society, and those members complained to the municipal and royal authorities of the well-known fraud and lies of the Jews, which supposedly gave them an advantage in commerce. This is a map of the areas of legal Jewish settlement in Russia in 1825. And I wish I could point it out to you, so I'll have to describe it to you. You can see the yellow area with the black around it. And what is in here is most of Russia most of Russian Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, most of the Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula, and Bessarabia. And the dark black are all the provinces within which Jewish settlement was permitted, and the dark black is outlining the yellow area. The diagonal black, which is outlined and it's in the lower area, was the areas where Jewish residents had to leave. When you go up north, the very top of the yellow area, there's a crosshatch space near the Baltic Sea, and that's where new Jewish settlement was forbidden. New Jewish settlement is up here. And then there's the black over here near the Austrian border, where no Jews were allowed to be. It was forbidden. I was really amazed at the fact that there were so many maps I could look at which would show the residency of the Jews as they progressed through Europe. This is a map of the Ukraine, which I got out of a recent copy of the New York Times, but it was still there then. It shows the Ukraine, and the Crimea, where many of the Jews came from, is circled at the bottom. This is a simpler map. Russia is up here. I'm still trying to get that red thing back. Okay. Here is Belarus, and then there's the Ukraine, and down at the bottom is the peninsula of the Crimea in the Black Sea. As more and more Jews moved into the Crimea, attitudes towards them changed, and they were no longer welcome, and they had to remain within the fencing or the pales. They didn't want them there anymore, so they had to move out. Some moved deeper into Siberia. Many emigrated to the United States. What is a pale? It's an archaic term, and it's derived from the Latin word for stake, which was extended to mean the area enclosed by a fence or boundary. Many of the small towns and villages were walled with stakes. And the word palisade is derived from the French word palisade, which means a fence made of pales or sharp stakes. That was not just a Russian practice. You probably learned in American history that palisaded settlements were common in colonial North America to protect against the indigenous peoples and wild animals. The English settlements of Jamestown and Plymouth, Massachusetts, were all originally fortified by surrounding them with palisades made of stakes or pales. I wanted to show you a picture of what one of them looked like, so I Googled Plymouth and palisade, and unfortunately, that's the only thing I was able to get. The Russian Revolution did very little to improve the status of the Jews. In the eyes of Soviet leadership, their ethnic nationality was viewed as a threat to the state. Stalin questioned their loyalty to him above all, and he was determined to move all possible dissenting groups, which certainly included the Jews, as far away as possible. From 1930 to 1952, on the orders of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and under the direction of the NKVD official Lavrentiy Beria, the government of the Soviet Union forcibly transferred populations of various groups. Those actions can be classified into broad categories. First were the deportations of anti-Soviet people, often classified as enemies of the people. Then there were deportations of entire nationalities. Stalin deported groups such as the Koreans, the Tatars, the kulaks, who were landed gentry, and Jews in particular were singled out because he didn't feel he had their full allegiance. The question was where he was going to send them. And then there were labor force transfers. By 1928, Stalin had set his sights on the Lower Amur region as a homeland for Russian Jews. It would serve as an alternative to Zionism, that is, the resettlement of Jews to Palestine. His underlying plan, however, involved fortifying a remote and very thinly populated area on the Soviet-Chinese border under the guise of a voluntary migration of people. Somehow, this translated into his expecting the Jews to hold back a Chinese invasion of Russia. For Soviet Jewry, Birobidzhan initially represented, at least for some, hope and opportunity for a true home for Jews and Yiddish culture in the Soviet Union. But instead, it became a shell of what it was meant to be. It had some of the trappings of Jewishness, but without much substance. So let's take a look at it. Here is Birobidzhan transliterated. There it is in Russian and in Yiddish. Until 2005, the world's largest menorah was not in Jerusalem or Lakewood, New Jersey, or even in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. It was found in the town square of Birobidzhan, the capital city of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Russia. The menorah is over 65 feet high. It uses 9 500-watt bulbs, and you can see it from a very great distance away. Most people connect a menorah with Hanukkah, when you light a candle every night for 8 nights. And if you could count that high, you see you don't reach 8, because this is not a Hanukkah menorah. A menorah is really a candle holder, and that's what they have there. Currently, the largest menorah is in Central Park. It was built there in 2005, and that's the Central Park menorah. I personally like the one in Birobidzhan better. The Jewish Autonomous Oblast is a far eastern landlocked Russian province on the border with China. This was a Portuguese map, and it shows Moscow all the way up in the left, and Birobidzhan is down here, the dark green, all the way on the Pacific border. I was able to find a single-colored map. That is Russia. And the little red thing down here is Birobidzhan. So you would now have some idea of the size of it compared to the size of Russia. Russia has many desolate black-watered oblasts. The unique significance of this one is that, for better or for worse, it was really the first modern Jewish state, although its founder's ideology and its eventual outcome were inferior to that of the Jewish state of Israel. This is a map of Birobidzhan. It has the Jewish AO standing for Autonomous Oblast. Birobidzhan is bound on 3 sides by the Amur River and its tributaries. The Amur is the world's 10th longest river, and it forms the border between the Russian Far East and northeastern China. If you see the light here on the bottom, at the bottom of the border of Birobidzhan, you see the blue line that goes all the way along, and that is the Amur River. The Amur has 2 tributaries. One of them is the Bura, and it comes right up from the Amur all the way up. It says the Bura. And the other one is the Bijan, and it starts at the Amur River and comes all the way up. So that this oblast is named after the tributaries Bura and Bijan. This is a close-up of the map, and you see the little area of Birobidzhan just to the north of China. And you see Vladivostok over here, and this light blue is the Pacific Ocean. This is the emblem of Birobidzhan. It's a Ussuri tiger on a shield with 2 blue stripes. The stripes represent the two rivers, the Bira and Bijan. And in checking out the Ussuri taiga, I read that it is at the top of the food chain and it fears nothing. That's a Ussuri taiga, sometimes called an Amur taiga. The average male measures between 6 and 7 feet, and the average weight is about 700 pounds. Tigers don't only live in Africa. These tigers have a lot of body fat in order to keep them warm during the long Siberian winters. They're almost extinct now, and there's a conservation program to try to increase their numbers. Despite how they may look to you, they are not man-eaters, they are omnivorous. Although as their habitat is being destroyed to make room for more towns and more villages, their natural prey has also been destroyed. And there are occasional accounts of a tiger which has attacked people because they're so hungry. And that's the emblem of Biran. Here's a little more about it. In 1928, the region known as Biran was designated. It would be the official territory for Jewish land colonization in Russia. It was designated by the Soviets after the Bolshevik Revolution. The mostly marshy area, approximately twice the size of New Jersey, had been annexed by Russia in 1858. The summers here are hot and rainy, the winters are cold and dry. There's the Trans-Siberian again, and it shows Moscow and Biran. You can get to Biran by the railroad. It takes 5 days and 13 hours from Moscow. You can also drive, but the train is cheaper and faster. If you want to go by car, the driving distance between Biran and Moscow is 5,074 miles. But you do have to stop to eat, to sleep, and hopefully find a gas station. When you're driving along a highway through the dense Siberian forest, you're lucky if you encounter a gas station every 60 to 70 miles. It takes about 106 hours to drive. It is expensive to fly, but it would be much faster. It would only be 8.5 hours from Vladivostok to Moscow. Since Russia is huge and it encompasses 2 continents, you have Europe that's around this area, around Moscow, and you have to cross the Urals and you get into the Siberia area. There are 8 time zones starting from Vladivostok area. Moscow is 7 hours behind Biran. If it is 6:30 a.m. in Biran, it is 11:30 the night before in Moscow. If you fly from Vladivostok at 3 a.m., you get to Moscow at 8 p.m. the day before. If you go in the other direction, you get there the next day. The train ride is even more confusing. There are different timetables for almost every stop because they're in different time zones. Modern technology such as Zoom has definitely improved business communications as well as social interactions. You no longer have to fly or drive to Moscow to do business with the government. Some 27,000 Russians, Cossacks, Koreans, and Ukrainians were already living in the region when Jewish settlement began. The Kremlin selected this particular territory for a few different reasons. One, they wanted to redirect the movement of Jews to the land away from the Ukraine, Belarus, and the Crimea, because the native populations were resisting further Jewish settlement. 2, to buffer the Soviet Union from Chinese and Japanese expansionism. And 3, to tap the natural resources, which were many, such as fish, timber, iron, graphite, and even gold. Where is this Crimea? This was taken out of the recent newspaper. You can see the Ukraine is in the inset here, and the Crimea is this peninsula in the Black Sea. Here you see Russia on the right, and you see Belarus, and the capital of Belarus is Minsk. Here you see the Ukraine, the capital is Kiev. And here you see the peninsula, the Crimea, the capital is Simferopol. What Stalin really wanted to do was to establish a so-called Jewish homeland, but without Judaism. Once he established it, he outlawed Hebrew and Jewish religious practices there. Over the next 20 years, those laws, along with Stalin's growing paranoia and purges of Jews, led the community into disaster and disarray. Azerbaijan was actually the first territorial administrative entity in the modern world designated for Jewish people. In 1924, the Politburo decided to create that region in Russia for Jews. And as I said, the Crimea was already filled, so they switched it to Azerbaijan. And the government set aside about 11 million acres of lands for them to build on. One caveat of the plan was that if Azerbaijan were to fail, it would serve as proof that the Jews were not even capable of running an oblast, much less a proper country. No matter how difficult things were for the Jews in Russia, it was still their ancestral home, and they were really not eager to relocate. So they had to be convinced, and the Soviet government offered each settler 600 rubles, free railroad passage, and food for the journey. That's like the 40 acres and a mule that the United States promised to slaves who had been freed after the Civil War. And then Russia had a tremendous advertising campaign to promote Azerbaijan. This is a film poster for the movie The Seekers of Happiness, which was released in the early 1930s by the Soviet government. And it's about a poor American family's decision to emigrate to Azerbaijan. Its alternative name was A Greater Promise. Through two love stories and a crime, it provides a basis to demonstrate how to overcome obstacles such as the end to poverty of the Jewish population and the transformation of Jews into farmers. Soviet propaganda organs produced pictures of smiling workers hauling grains and driving tractors in the Soviet versions of the Promised Land. This is a staged picture. I have no idea who the man was. I don't know if he was Jewish. I don't know if that was a real tractor he was on. But many of the European Jews who made the trip did so because they had absolutely nothing and felt that they had nothing to lose. And in the 1930s, there was an even more compelling reason for Soviet Jews, especially from the Ukraine, to come to Azerbaijan. Tens of thousands of Soviets were suffering and dying of starvation in the first half of the decade under Stalin's collectivization policies. We left the Ukraine to escape hunger, said a teacher who came there as a young girl in 1932. I don't think anyone came for religious reasons. They just didn't want to starve to death. This is a book entitled Azerbaijan and Palestine. It was published in both Yiddish and Russian, and it underscored the Soviet government's conviction that the newly selected territory in the Soviet Far East was a viable alternative to Palestine. The Kremlin also hoped to score propaganda points in the international arena by establishing the first Jewish homeland in the modern era. In order to resolve the socioeconomic difficulties of the Russian Jews and to promote agricultural labor, on January 17, 1925, the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, formally created two committees, the Komzet and the Ozet. The Komzet was the Committee for the Agricultural Achievement of Jews. They had land for new colchoses or collective farms, which were contributed and distributed by the Soviet government via the Komzet. The Ozet was known as the Society for the Settlement of Jewish Toilers on the Land, and it oversaw the financial and practical aspects of settling the Jews in Birobidzhan. The Ozet's job was to assist in moving settlers to a new location, helping them with house building and irrigation, and providing them with cattle, agricultural tools, education, medical, and cultural services. The funds were to be provided by private donations, charities, and lotteries. This is a meeting of the Ozet Lottery Committee in Moscow in 1929. And this is a fundraising lottery ticket. I don't think it was a winner. There are a lot of photographs on the Birobidzhan website that were probably all taken for publicity purposes, but they usually gave a heroic image of the life of the settlers. An entire album was produced by an American organization formed in the 30s to promote and raise funds for Birobidzhan. The album was called Jerusalem on the Amur. In April 1928, the first Jewish immigrants arrived. They came by train, and this looks like large numbers of people stuffed into passenger cars. Here's another group arriving by train. It looks like they've been stuffed into freight cars. I found it very interesting the way they dressed, because I knew that they were heading into the wilderness. But they had been sold quite a bill of goods, and they were expecting to find a glorious city when they got there. Some of them came by wagon, and some even walked. And that sounds much harder than it actually was. On this map, here are the Ural Mountains, the yellow down here, and here is Moscow. The Urals are only about 3,000 to 4,000 feet high. You can compare them to the Rocky Mountains, which are 14,000 feet high. So they could walk, but it took a very long time because of the weather. They could not travel during the long winter months, and they were long. The spring and the summer were the only times, and they just had stayed in inns along the way till they got there. But when they finally arrived in Birobidzhan, they found that there were no homes. They had not been built, so they had to live in tents or other makeshift quarters while building their own houses. Here are some of them with some of the farm implements they had been given. The settlers were not provided with suitable equipment to help them meet their goals. I'm not sure what that is. It looks like a cross between a tractor and a tank. The Judaism of the oblast was entirely secular. The authorities took great pride and probably thought it was pretty funny when they established a pig farm there for the Jews to take care of. I'm not sure how the Jews felt about it. Here's a picture of women pioneers in Birobidzhan, Jewish milkmaids, men fishing. Here they are rolling logs on the river, working in the fields. And here's a Jewish farmer in Birobidzhan. In the 1930s, many Jewish intellectuals promoted the project with vigor. Jews actually traveled to Birobidzhan from inside the Soviet Union, from all over Western Europe, and even further afield. They did go from the United States as well. In 1934, Birobidzhan was granted full autonomous status. Besides having Jewish school, they had a Jewish newspaper called the Birobidzhan Stern, the Birobidzhan Star. They had Jewish theater, and the official language was Yiddish. Here are some more early scenes. There's a wooden synagogue in 1935. Here's an early street scene in the 1930s. And not surprisingly, there were Jewish doctors in the hospital. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the borders opened, about 70 families of Jewish doctors left, and medicine in the region has still not fully recovered. Even before its inception, Birobidzhan was predicted to fail. The land was plagued with frost, swamps, insects, disease, and sub-zero winters. It is 300 miles from the ocean. It is 3,000 miles from Western Russia. The growing season there is very short, and there was no existing infrastructure. Also, since until recently the Jews had been largely forbidden from owning or renting land in Europe, the territory was to be populated by city people with little to no experience in agriculture. The first exodus from Birobidzhan began almost as soon as the settlers arrived. In the first year, more than half the settlers returned to their places of origin, and immigration was very small. What little there was largely due to the rampant unemployment caused in Russia by revolution, famine, and civil war. Between 1928 and 1938, 41,000 Jews arrived. By the end of 1938, 28,000 of those had left voluntarily. As the political climate in Russia worsened in the late 1930s, the entire political leadership and membership of the Writers' Club of Birobidzhan disappeared into labor camps. But nonetheless, the Jewish Autonomous Region had a very good publicity agent. There were many groups and publications which were significantly strong, even in Western countries, which promoted the settlement in Birobidzhan. They raised money and they sponsored Jewish families' immigration there. Many of those Jews had been disenfranchised in their home countries, and they were really taken in by the romantic ideal of tilling the soil and building a homeland. It was the same ideal that inspired people to move to Palestine. But Birobidzhan became the unlucky home of tens of thousands of Soviet Jews who were actually lured there by heavy-handed propaganda. Jews from America, from Europe, and even from Palestine embraced the barren place as a promised land, although most of the non-Soviet Jews were later executed. Life in Birobidzhan was written up in many publications. This is a photo of kindergartners in the Jewish Autonomous Region from the June 1935 edition of the Yiddish-English publication Nai Leben, or New Life, which was published in New York. The magazine extolled Jewish life in Birobidzhan and portrayed it as a Jewish paradise. There were also quotes from many famous people. You may have heard of this one. Einstein said, "I feel impelled to recognize thankfully that Birobidzhan is of great significance for a part of the Jewish people, and I appreciate that furthering of this colony by the Russian government is a generous help to them." In July 1938, Nai Leben published a photo of Chaim Rosen and his family with the caption, "Happy Parents and Their Little Boy." It appeared the very month of Rosen's arrest by the NKVD. After World War II, Jewish immigration to the Jewish Autonomous Region picked up. Between 1945 and 48, the total Jewish population there was about 40,000. And there was a major cultural advance in the Yiddish press, the theater, and even literature. The Jewish language writers who had survived the war flocked to Birobidzhan. The Soviet regime took care of that. In 1948 and 9, the writers, all the Jewish writers, were arrested on charges of belonging to a subversive bourgeois nationalist conspiracy. They were convicted of trying to make a national culture other than that of the official Soviet culture. Joseph Stalin dealt a further blow to Yiddish on the night of August 12, 1952, when he ordered the execution of Yiddish poets, writers, and cultural and political figures in the USSR. 13 Jews were executed on that night. The other framed defendants were accused of espionage and treason, and they endured years of imprisonment and torture in Soviet prisons. Most of the detainees were sent to Siberia to work as Stalin's slave labor force until they either died from hard work or until Stalin finally died. The survivors were released from captivity after spending long years in forced labor, and they were reunited with their families. But the revival of Jewish life or Yiddish life in Birobidzhan was essentially dead. Also after the war under Stalin, nearly all the Yiddish institutions of Birobidzhan were liquidated. The Yiddish language schools were shut down or quickly reformed as Russian language schools. The Jewish orphanage was disbanded, and the charges were torn away from one another and shipped to children's homes in other regions where their names were often changed. Yiddish language books and journals were confiscated from libraries, bookstores, and even warehouses and burned. 4 years after the end of World War II, the Soviet regime staged a mass burning of Yiddish language books. The Birobidzhan Library was purged of its Judaica section, and over 30,000 books were burned. Starting around 1948, the region suffered a rapid exodus to the more promising state of Israel. The Soviet government lashed out at that and restricted the freedom of Jews even more. Citizens were generally limited from emigrating, and the Jews, especially after 48, were exceptionally limited. The term used to describe the various ethnicities who were denied the right to emigrate was refusnik. Despite all this, between the founding of the State of Israel in 1959, nearly 16,000 Jews left Birobidzhan. The Jewish Agency, an Israeli government-affiliated organization, provided a free one-way ticket to Israel for any Birobidjani who could prove their Jewish ancestry, and nearly all the region's Jews accepted the offer to get out of Birobidzhan. Nikita Khrushchev declared the Jewish state of Birobidzhan a failure. In 1958, when he said this, there were only about 14,000 Jews in the oblast of Birobidzhan out of a total population about 326,000, and that's about 4%. Mikhail Gorbachev was president of the Soviet Union from 1990 to 1991. And under perestroika, the Jewish national culture was less suppressed, and in fact, it was encouraged in Birobidzhan. Jewish Sunday schools were open, Jewish holidays were publicly observed. But after 70 years of suppression and assimilation, there was a pervasive ignorance of Judaism and Jewish culture. Today's fragile Jewish community is mainly contained within the capital. This is the central square of Birobidzhan. At the state-supported Jewish day school, over 1,000 students from the 1st to 11th grades study Yiddish and Hebrew, Jewish history, Jewish tradition, Jewish literature, Jewish dance, and Jewish cuisine, although more than 80% of them are not Jewish. When asked why, the answer is why not? Many non-Jewish parents say that since they live in the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, they want their children to know about Jewish culture. Yiddish is still the region's second official language after Russian, although it is spoken only by a handful of the approximately 3,500 remaining Jews. The Birobidzhan Stern, that's the Birobidzhan Star, is now published in Russian, but it has 2 pages in Yiddish every week. That's because the paper's editor studied Yiddish in school and she loves the language. She said she intended to go on publishing the Yiddish pages even though most people in the city could not read them. One of the stranger parts of Birobidzhan's story is that although it was meant to be a Jewish state, Judaism was alien to Soviet atheism and frowned upon. The local museum contains Yiddish leaflets warning locals not to celebrate Passover, and back issues of the Birobidzhan Stern from the 1980s, although written in Yiddish, has absolutely no discussion of either Judaism or Israel. Jewish life continues today. There are 3 synagogues in Birobidzhan. The main one is run by an Orthodox Jew from Israel. He does not speak Yiddish. The services are in Hebrew. He said that he was born in Birobidzhan and his family went to Israel, but after he grew up and became a rabbi, he returned to his birthplace. He said the local Jewish community is about 3,000, and he only has about 30 regulars in his congregation. This is the central synagogue of Birobidzhan. This is the inside of that synagogue. And in 2010, President Medvedev was the first Russian president to visit there. Actually, he was also the last. After Russia invaded the Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Israel became one of the main destinations for a large wave of emigration, an exodus that included many workers from Russia's technical industries. The emigration numbers increased when Putin announced plans to call up army reservists. In July 2022, Russia threatened to ban a major Jewish nonprofit agency that helps people emigrate to Israel from operating in Russia. They were concerned that Israel had been taking some of the best minds out of Russia. They threatened, but they didn't actually do that. Here is another synagogue, the Bet Teshuvah. It's located in a blue wooden house and it operates irregularly. A flood recently damaged many of its rare books. Since 2005, the religious services have been strictly Jewish and no longer include a blend of Christian and Jewish traditions. Recently, some Jewish artifacts have been discovered there, including an old prayer book offering a prayer for the Tsar. May the one who gives power to kings and sovereignty to princes, may the one who is the ruler of rulers bless and keep, guard and aid, exalt and raise the Tsar Nicholas Alexandrovich, his widowed mother, the Tsarina Maria Fyodorovna, and his wife, the royal Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, and their heir Grigory. May God save them from all harm and pain, and may all their enemies fall before them. And may the merciful one put in the heart of the Tsar compassion and good deeds for the people of Israel. When I read that, all I could think of Tevye's prayer in Fiddler. May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from me. Although Jewish autonomy hasn't exactly worked out, there are lots of vestiges of it. This is the sign for Lenin Street, written in Yiddish. Here is an ATM sign, written in Yiddish. This is the Simis restaurant. That is not Hebrew. It's Cyrillic letters that written in a Hebrew-like font. And that's how Tsimis would be if it was transliterated into Russian. Also, we find this statue in Birobidzhan, and why not? He was the founder. This is a breakdown of the various religions there, and the most recent information I could get was from 2012. It does not list Judaism. I think the Jews might be found among spiritual but not religious, other or undeclared. Masha Gessen is a Russian-American journalist, author, and activist, and an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin. In her book, Where the Jews Aren't, she describes Birobidzhan as the worst good idea ever. She said it follows a relatively standard Soviet script, a grandiose utopian project whose realization was plagued from the beginning by a lack of necessary resources and the shifting political fortunes of those in charge. This is a sign on entering the city. Birobidzhan in Russian on the left, in Yiddish on the right. When the Olympics were held in Sochi, the torch was carried through Birobidzhan. This is the entrance to the railroad station, and this is the end. I want to thank you for listening. I'll be happy to answer some questions, but I need to clarify and say I have never been to Russia. I have never been to Birobidzhan. I do not speak Yiddish. I guess I should also thank the internet. And that's it. Okay. So, I don't know if you have questions.
Gerry, did you read anything about the government? How many of the Duma oblasts are Jews or have ever been, or the governors?
I don't know. I do know that the original governors were all friends of the Tsar. And they were certainly nobles from his court. And I doubt whether any of them were Jews.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Weren't there a lot of the Russian Jews that emigrated to China?
That was that was, I think, around World War II, where they went to Harbin. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
Just Dara Horn talks about that in her book. Dara Horn is an author, and she has written a book recently called Everybody Loves Dead Jews. And she talks about, and this kind of reminds me of the settlement of Harbin by Russian Jews and how the Chinese are observing it. It's like Alice in Wonderland, really. Both of these things are like Alice in Wonderland.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.